So I was back at my hotel after unloading all the information back to the city desk, and it was about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. Got a call from Phil Curry, who was the city editor, and said that they just received word that the bodies of the hostages who had been killed were being sent to Monroe County Medical Examiner's office in Rochester. Now, the medical examiner's office was part of my beat as a police reporter, and so I knew them all, so it was the call to send me up to talk to the guys at the medical examiner's office. So I pull up, and there's a bunch of my friends and the folks I know from the medical examiner's office and the sheriff's department standing outside the building getting a smoke. So I had a jacket that it was a sport coat, because we always wore sport coat and tie in those days. And I noticed that a pen had leaked through the pocket, and we were talking about how do I get ink out of my pocket when Carl Lupo, who was the senior civilian member of the medical examiner's office staff, he was a former butcher in another life, so he was well trained for his position. But he came up to me and says, "Yo, Cooper, where did the media get this story about slashed throats?" So I said, well, what do you mean, Carl? And he said, well, the autopsies, we completed the autopsies, and they all died of gunshot wounds. And there was no slashed throats. There was indication of some trauma. There might have been some roughhouse beating. They might have been worked over a bit. But he said all the fatal injuries were gunshots. So, I said, well, what kind of gunshots? And he said, well, it was .30-06, it was double-aught buck, and it was .38 caliber revolver, which was the arsenal of the police. We had been told the day before that the inmates did not have any firearms. They had a lot of weapons. They had spears and swords and knives and razors, but no firearms. So I realized I have a pretty good story here. We were only 15 minutes from the medical examiner's office to the office of the Times-Union, so I drove in, and John Doherty, who was the managing editor, was working as the slot on the Attica desk. All the Attica copy was going directly through him. So I walked up and I said, "JD, I've got a really big story here. I've got a confirmed report that on the record that the inmates apparently did not kill the hostages. The hostages were all died of gunshot wounds, and there were no slashed throats." And Doherty, who was a World War II Army intelligence officer, looked at me and he shook his head and he says, "Yeah, go call him back and check it out again." Now you got to realize Doherty was a fellow who one of his mottos was, "If your mother says she loves you, check it out." And so he was suspect of this 24-year-old reporter coming in and telling him something that the entire state police and prison system had given a contrary statement. So I call up Carl back at the medical examiner's office, say, "Carl, it's Dick," and I went through the whole thing about the caliber of the weapons, the trauma in the body, but the fatal injuries were all gunshots, and he confirmed it. This was all on the record. So I sat down and wrote the lead into the story, went over and handed it to John, and he looked at it, and he shook his head again, and he says, "Call him back and check this one more time." So I called Carl Lupo, read him what I had, he confirmed it, it was all on the record. So about the time I'm writing, John Mahachek, who was the education writer at the Times-Union at the time, was dispatched back to the medical examiner's office to see if he could get any more detail. Because we were still live, we were an afternoon newspaper, and this is still live in our cycle. So John shows up at the medical examiner's office, and he sees this fellow walking down the hall in a blood-stained smock eating a tuna fish sandwich. And he said, "You Dr. Edlin?" And he said, "Yes." And so it was Dr. John Edlin, who was the medical examiner for the county. So John says, "Well, this is the story we've got," and he gave him all the information. And Dr. Edlin says, well, you've got the story, and he confirmed it. So for the last edition, which hit the streets about 3:30 in the afternoon, the attribution of the story went from being Carl Lupo, the senior civilian, to Dr. John Edlin, the senior medical examiner. Our story was on the streets at 3:30. All of the rest of the media was still at Attica. And the story suddenly shifted because my managing editor, again, he wanted to make sure. He had called the AP in Albany and said, call Nelson Rockefeller's office and see what comments you can get from him about this. Well, they didn't even know that yet because the medical examiner had not released the information to the police yet at that point. So then they held a press conference about 6 o'clock that night. Edlin came out. He confirmed everything that we had. Our story was already on the streets. It said gunshots, not knives, killed hostages. And that was the story that the following year that John Mahachek and I got won the Pulitzer for general local reporting.